So Sternberg's model of abilities as developing expertise is probably not going to be maybe relevant for every piece of TL that you might look at. But what you might find it relevant for is maybe more interactive pieces of TL or pieces of TL that require engagement over longer periods of time, that might have repeated elements of challenge and practice. And it's not maybe useful for assignment 2, but where you might find this particularly useful is down the line when you're looking at things like game development, because it's quite a useful model for that. So very briefly, Sternberg, Robert Sternberg is an American psychologist and psychometrician. I think that's how that's pronounced. And he's known for a triarchic theory of critical, creative, and practical intelligence. And his main area of research is about abilities as form of developing expertise. And he claimed that the development of expertise involves the interaction of a number of different elements, all of which kind of accumulated in his model of abilities as developing expertise. So you can see here that this is an approach which is very much based on repeated elements of practice and application, and it's focused on moving from kind of a novice through focused practice to an expert who works on reflective practice, and potentially back again. So the notion of this approach is very much based around kind of moving from a novice to being an expert through repeated iterations of practice. And you can see at the heart of everything there as well within this kind of diagram is motivation. So motivation being a key element. So it's not about representation maybe of, going back to his triarchic theory, this kind of, that learning and developing expertise is this confluence involving the interaction of a number of different elements, including critical, creative, and practical intelligences. And you can see kind of in the lower kind of quadrants here as well, there's also the element of context. So when you get into reflective practice, into critical and creative thinking, then context plays a bigger role. But when you're a novice, maybe more focused practice leads to learning and leads to the development of metacognition and procedural and declarative knowledge. But essentially, it's quite a useful diagram, I think, just in terms of trying to reflect that notion of going from a novice through repeated iterations of practice with knowledge, with kind of motivation at the center, to becoming an expert. So a couple of elements that maybe go into the model. Metacognitive skills are essentially people's understandings and control of their thought process. And you see here metacognition kind of lies over in the left-hand side. So going from through novice practice to explicit and implicit learning, which leads to metacognition. So metacognitive skills would generally be skills that involve us knowing what we're doing. So you might, for example, an example might be writing an essay or solving arithmetic problems. So it would involve kind of a good awareness of our own kind of thought processes. Metacognition is kind of referred, in a learning context, is often referred to, learning about learning or knowledge about learning. Maybe comparison, there is a thing in, computer programming called metadata, and metadata is this kind of idea that this is the information about the information. So metadata, which might accompany a YouTube video, might be, for example, this is a YouTube video called, how to fix your car. It's to do with kind of auto repair. It's, 10 minutes long, so on and so forth. So it's kind of metacognition is kind of understanding and controlling our own thought processes. Learning skills would essentially refer to people's ability to learn, both in terms of putting in effort to learn, but also the learning that we do in the background, the way we kind of pick up information incidentally, without any kind of systematic effort. So I suppose very often you can maybe to a certain degree divide those up into, I suppose, kind of formal learning, which we'd undertake in school, which we would take in kind of university or elsewhere in on the job training that we would do, it involves us kind of making an effort and consciously making a decision to engage in the learning process. But as human beings, we're learning the entire time anyway. So, learning skills would also include the learning that we do when we're not trying to learn, but when we learn anyway. Thinking skills then, in Sternberg's model, he has three main types of thinking skills, which we mentioned earlier. Critical or analytical thinking skills, so that would involve things like, critiquing something, judging something, and that would also include, comparing something, contrasting something, kind of being able to break something down, being able to assess it, being able to kind of consider it against other elements or kind of in a wider context. Creative thinking skills then, I suppose imagining, supposing, hypothesizing, discovering, elements which involve us kind of to a degree making something from nothing. So being able to be creative, being able to kind of draw connections or come up with things ourselves. And practical thinking skills then, Sternberg said that practical thinking skills are involved when we're applying our knowledge or our intelligence to real world context. And not that those are, I suppose, a accumulation of the previous two, but they would, I suppose practical thinking skills would very much depend on existing knowledge that we'd already have, being able to apply that in the real world. And very often, I suppose, practical thinking skills to a certain degree can't be taught the same way critical skills and creative thinking skills might be. Practical thinking skills involve our application in real world situations, so can be seen as a bit more challenging. Knowledge then, I suppose, is just the information which we take in and our retention of it and our ability to bring it up. And Sternberg identified that there's two types of knowledge, which I think we might have already mentioned in the module. Declarative knowledge, which is knowledge of facts, concept, principles, laws, so on and so forth. And procedural knowledge, which is knowledge of strategies, of, I can't think of another word, procedures, but kind of the chaining of these kind of things, of processes which we engage in. I suppose the way I always try to think of it is declarative knowledge is knowing that, and procedural knowledge is knowing how. And very often we will need both. So declarative is knowing that information, that fact, that principle, that concept. Procedural is knowing how that works, how that can be put into practice, how all that comes together. So Sternberg's notion of developing expertise is based around our ability to use these thinking skills along with the knowledge that we have, which is kind of why their thinking is available down here and our knowledge is available here, and you can see there that the two are linked. And then at the heart of all that, like we said, is motivation. So at the center of all these elements, and it's a quote from Sternberg, at the center, driving the elements, is motivation. Without it, the elements remain inert. So motivation drives metacognitive skills, which in turn activates learning and thinking skills, which provide feedback to our metacognitive skills, allowing us to increase our level of expertise. So yeah, so you can see there visually, the reason motivation is in between all of these things is because it drives each of them, and each of them, these kind of tie into each other, support each other, feed each other, drive each other. Context as well, like we said then, is up in the kind of in the lower quadrant area, so more to do in the kind of in the expert zone, in the kind of practice zone. And context is essentially seen as the characteristics not just of our environment, or not just of like the classroom, the area in which we learn, but also in terms of the characteristics of us as learners. So they're kind of everything that, so context for Sternberg is everything which affects the context in which we learn, the context in which we operate. And, if you take that at face value, that's potentially a big list. That's the classroom, the environment, the VLE, the learner, their classmates, their lecturer, their technical ability, the support staff, everything really. Motivation motivation is at the heart. You can see here context is all of the kind of in the lower quadrants, the kind of the elements which affect us as learning. And one area in which this Sternberg's model is potentially particularly applicable is digital games or kind of game-based learning. And you can see there, even in terms of, this is kind of a representation of a common gameplay loop. So if we think about games very broadly, games at their heart are really just about kind of, any game experience is always really about just kind of constant challenge, constant reward and feedback, and kind of that continually ramping up. So in any game, let's say you start off at level 1, and let's say in the game you got to solve a puzzle. So you solve that puzzle, you're presented with a challenge, you overcome it, and then you level up. So you go into level 2, where the challenge is increased, and that challenge then repeats itself. So once you solve that, you move on to level 3, and that's even tougher. Level 4, that's even tougher. And through this process, you get very good at playing that game. You move from being a novice game player to an expert game player. And you can see there, even visually, it's very similar to Sternberg's model. So it's this constant driving loop where you're moving through kind of repeated iterations of challenge and feedback and overcoming that, which takes you from a novice into being an expert. And at the heart of all of that is motivation. And I suppose one of the reasons games are such attractive tools for learning is because they are very motivating. Games in and of themselves are motivating elements. It's why people spend so much time and energy and money playing games, because they are at their heart very motivating. That constant element of challenge, overcoming that challenge, so on and so forth. So even visually, there is a bit of a kind of a tie-in to Sternberg's model. And even if we take a more complicated game, or let's say a more complicated representation of a game, you can see that again there is that kind of similar tie-in to Sternberg. So if we look at Heyday, which was, I think it's an old enough game at this stage, but was this game based around kind of, you build up a farm, you harvest your crops, you improve your farm, so on and so forth. It's a similar kind of process. So if we look at Heyday, and I think this isn't a bad model if you are kind of looking at game-based learning, this isn't a bad model maybe to try and develop a game based around. Again, it's this idea of a loop. There is a gameplay loop, there is a repeated process, and that becomes more fast-paced, more challenging, more difficult as time goes on. So in a game like Heyday, you're constantly collecting resources, selling those off, buying new stuff, upgrading your whatever, and repeating that process. So, but you can see here there are all these additional elements inside in this loop. So the same way Sternberg's model has context and has motivation and has all these other elements, inside in games there are similar kind of elements. There's the development of experience points. So you move on to level 2, you move on to level 3, you kind of go up in the game. There is the element of time in games. So time is a resource inside in games. Heyday as well is what's known as a free-to-play game or a freemium game, which is this idea that kind of you can play the game, but if you want to spend real-world money, stuff will happen a little bit quicker, a little bit better. In a game-based learning environment or using games for learning, that can be a very powerful tool as well. This notion that you try and that you can use learning as a currency. So if a player can demonstrate learning, they can progress, or they can make their playing of the game a bit more enjoyable or a bit more engaging, and so on and so forth. And I suppose kind of again with Heyday, that in the middle there refers to that P2P marketplace. So that notion that you can spend real world money to kind of move along to avoid what's known down here as grinding, which is this kind of hours and hours of doing the same thing just to get it done. You can skip that by, I'm sure you've seen it yourselves in plenty of games, you spend real world money to buy 50 gems or 50 coins or whatever, and that lets you move through the game quicker. So again, it's maybe a useful model in that context as well, just to be able to compare the a basic gameplay loop, but also maybe a more complicated gameplay loop. And if you were to look at game design for learning down the line, Sternberg is not a bad, I think, thing to pull out and to kind of point to, because it does kind of represent to a degree that kind of gameplay loop, and that notion that kind of through repeated challenge, through repeated practice, you do move from a novice to becoming more of an expert. and the important thing as well, that motivation be at the heart of it. And that ties into an element of game-based learning, because very often, a lot of serious games are very not fun to play. And if you lose the player's motivation, if you take away that kind of engine at the heart of it, then it can be very difficult to get a player or a learner to engage in a serious game. And it's something which we've used ourselves in terms of, these are a couple of serious games that we've developed in the department through research projects. One was based on kind of teaching coaching skills through kind of basketball. So this was kind of, Sternberg was the basis for this particular gameplay loop, where the entire game is really based around planning your kind of athletes, your training, evaluating and reflecting depending on performance, so on and so forth. Similarly, this is a game called the Green Hipster Hotel. It's up on the Android store and the iOS store if you're interested. But again, very much kind of based on that kind of heyday idea. You're in a constant process of building and upgrading the hotel, hiring staff, managing resources. But the notion is that kind of that you can, like what we looked at with Heyday, you can kind of save yourself time and energy if you watch a little movie and answer a question, or kind of engage in something. All of this can be helped to get through the game in a more effective way, to make it a bit more fun, to cut down on grinding. But again, it is that notion that it's a loop, and that gameplay loop is really, I suppose, that it's about establishing that gameplay loop and then looking where you can build in the learning, where you can build in the education. So Sternberg's model of abilities is developing expertise. Like I said, it's not going to be relevant for every single piece of TEL out there, but it might be useful for you, like I said, if you're looking at kind of larger pieces of TEL that require engagement over longer periods of time, that have a lot of repeated challenge and practice. And down the line, hopefully, if you are looking at developing games, maybe even for semester 2, it's not a bad model to take, and just to maybe try and identify from that the gameplay loop and how learning might fit into that particular kind of that loop, that gameplay kind of area.